Hello, welcome to highlights from Grand Swiss Liga round 2. We're going to begin with game between Swiercz and Firouzja. In this position, Swiercz played e5. If he played bishop e2, he would be almost winning, because if he goes to g5, then e5 is very strong. Sorry, first g4, and after the knight moves, then e5. Because the point is, after d5, then h4 would trap the rook. And if you go d5 here, then knight d6 would happen, and after knight d8, first knight c8, and then after this, bishop a6, and the a pawn would be very dangerous for black. And if on bishop e2 he plays rook f4, then white can capture on h5, and after rook f2 he would capture, and the d6 pawn would hang in the end. Because let's say he plays queen g5, takes, and knight d6. And white is a pawn up, and also his pawn, black's pawns are just too weak. 5 pawns, 5 pawn islands, it's not good. But instead, white played e5 here, and black immediately plays queen h4, attacking the knight on c4, and also he wants to go knight g3 to fork the rook and the king. And now white doesn't want to capture on d6 because of knight g3, and if king g1 he can just capture, and but even this position is not so bad for white, but white didn't want to enter this. Even though the a6 pawn is going to hang very soon, but it seemed better to just play this, rook f3. But now black takes on c4, and he has 2 knights for a rook. But white also has his chances. His d pawn is a passed pawn, and it might run far. Queen d5 is played to try to stop somehow this d pawn, but now queen f2. Maybe it was a moment to play queen b6 to target a6 and to change the d passed pawn for the a passed pawn. Queen f2 targeting f7 pawn, knight g5 defending it, and now rook d3 trying to support the d6 pawn, queen a5, and now d7. Knight goes back to e6 to cover the d8 square, and here rook d6. Threatening rook takes e6 because the rook on f8 is undefended. And now black connects his knights with knight hg7, and white takes on c6. I think it was better just to double the rooks on the d file and keep this d pawn alive. But instead he takes on c6, and now after queen d5 it's not possible to save the pawn. Rook takes a6, and now queen d7, and now black gets enough time to regroup his pieces, and because white's pawns on the queen side are just too far away from queening, and black might be able to arrange some attack on the king side. Rook a7, and now he has to go back to e8 to defend f7. White starts pushing, because if he doesn't, he cannot hope for saving the game. Knight f5 is played. Now he tries to block the f-file and also to bring his knight into the game. b4, queen c6, rook c1, and now knight d4. Now these knights are jumping around and it's not really comfortable for white to find a move here. Rook a2 and now rook e8. Bringing the next piece into the play, rook b2. Trying to support these pawns on b4 and c4 from behind. Queen e4 was played. b5 and now knight e3. Getting even closer to white's king. Queen e1 and now queen f4. Introducing maybe knight g4 as a potential threat on the next move. Queen g3 to offer a trade, because if you trade queens, as I think white has good chances to even win this game if he trades queens. So black just avoids it by queen f6, rook e1 and now king g7. Simply gets out of a potential check in case black plays knight f5, so rook e8 is not a check. Queen f2 and now knight df5. And here white makes a mistake and plays rook bb1, allowing knight g4. So here h3 was better to stop this, but still it was not really pleasant to play it during the game, because it weakens the g3 square and it seems like it's making lots of holes in black's position. And maybe also white didn't want to give up the c4 pawn like this. But this should be a draw, because after takes and knight b2, white would just go b6, and after knight d3, queen f3, supporting the pawn and attacking the knight, and after knight c5, b7 would come, and after takes, knight d6, this queen ending in the end should be a draw. Black is slightly better due to his extra pawn, but pawns are on the same flank, so I don't think black has many chances to make any good progress. Instead, he plays rook bb1 here. And now knight g4 happens, and on queen f4, queen h4. Rook f1, because if he takes the rook, knight f2 is going to happen and the queen is hanging. After this, queen takes f2 and queen and knight versus two rooks, it's too much. So rook f1 is played and now rook e4. Now if he takes, of course you can checkmate. Silly me. Queen c7 to keep defending, now knight h2. And white had to play king g1, because if he takes on h2, knight g3 happens, king g1, and after this, king h1, we have a nice checkmating pattern. So he has to step away with king g1, but now white is a piece up. Black is a piece up here. And after rook f1, rook takes c4, and white gave only this check on e5, and after queen f6, the game was over. I think white took and resigned in this position. Because there's nothing to do. King f6, this b pawn is just not advanced enough. Black can just stop it, like rook b7, plant his knight on d5 and take it very soon. The next position is from the game between Vincent Keymer and Jeffery Xiong. And here white was to move, and he played rook h c1. And black decided to make things even sharper than they were. He played f5, trying to break those central pawns. Instead of f5, I think bishop a5 was the best move here. And the idea behind this bishop a5 move is to go knight d3 next. And that threat is really uncomfortable for white. The one way to parry this threat is to play queen c2 to offer an exchange of queens, and after black takes, he can take on e4 also. And after king e4, he would take on c4, king d3, rook c3, and it would fizzle out into some draw. After bishop b6, takes, white is not able to use the extra pawn on the queen side, because the rook is just too active, and it's also his pawns on the king side are pretty fragile, so even maybe black's the one who can play for a win here. But instead he asked for a fight with f5. White took, and after gf, he took on c5. Instead, he should play g4 here to make black's king side much weaker. And after takes, with the pawn, not with the king, of course. And bishop g7. If he plays bishop g7, then rook b4 would be strong, and after a move like queen a5, bishop e2. To get out of this pin, and it seems like black's king side is going to crumble anytime. So g4 was a good alternative to bishop c5. After bishop c5, now black has a good initiative here. White plays bishop d3, and now queen d4. Attacking the d5 pawn, and also trying to go bishop d2 if bishop moves from d3. Bishop takes on f5, and now bishop d2. Trying to go rook c3 or even queen e3, queen e2 in some variations. Rook d1 and now rook c3. And it seems really scary for white. It seems like if black goes to e3, he's just going to give a checkmate. But bishop on f5 does the great job of keeping everything together, because if the king goes to h1, he's safe, because the h3 pawn is not going to fall. King g2, and now black is playing for perpetual with rook g3. White avoids it, because I think that if you take here, queen f4 is simply going to be perpetual, because king g2, rook c3 even works, I guess. Or here just queen e3. Queen e3, and after this queen e2. And just keep giving checks. If king h1, queen f3, and just give checks. And it's a draw. So he escapes it by king h1, and now queen f4. Now queen f3 is a threat, so white plays bishop e6 first, king h8, and now queen takes d2. And now black makes a mistake. He plays queen e4. He should have played queen f3, and after king h2, then rook c3. And if this check happens, then just rook g7, and white has to deal with some threats like queen g3 and queen g2. or rook c2 also. So even though this rook looks pinned, it's doing its job. It's defending the king, and also there are other pieces who can, which can make trouble to white. So if queen b2, then just rook h3 and takes, king g1 and queen g4. And black keeps giving checks. Because if on king g1, queen g4, he plays queen g2, now black has rook g3. And now he might even consider playing for a win here. Why not? But instead, in the game, he played queen e4. King h2 and now rook c2. He's going to capture the queen, but for a high price. He takes and takes on g3. So now white has two rooks and the bishop for a queen, and now the only thing left for black is to keep giving checks. And for white is to escape checks, of course. And now we have a sequence of moves. King f2, queen c5, king e2, queen c2. Now white is trying to outmaneuver his opponent, to somehow stop him from giving checks. Now rook g1, queen a2, and now he's heading towards his corner on h1. And after king g7, rook bf1 to cut off the king, so he cannot escape. Queen e3 and now king h2. Check, king h6, rook f5. Now black barely has any check. Eventually on d2, but that's going to be the last check. Now queen d3, and now black is just waiting for white to do something. Rook g2, slowly preparing. Queen b1, and now bishop d7. Defending the b5 pawn. Queen e4, and now rook gf2. Queen e3, bishop e8. And now rook h5, that was the point of bishop e8. King g7, and now rook f7. In case of king g8, you have this and this checkmate. So he has to go to h8, but now just this check, king, and in this position black resigned, because if he goes to g8, we have rook h8, king g7, rook h7, and this check on f8. And if he goes to g5, it's a checkmate on h5, and if he goes to e5, then rook takes e7, loses the queen, and it is game over. Let's go to the next position. This one is from the game Aleksandra Goryachkina and Grigoriy Oparin. And here Goryachkina made a big mistake. She played rook f1. She should have played rook d1 or rook c1. It doesn't matter, just to give the space to the king, so that rook f3 in this case doesn't work. Oops, spoilers. After rook f1, Oparin played rook takes f3, and if she takes on f3, then knight takes, and she has to give up the queen in that case. Because if king g2, then just knight h4, and the position is crumbling. So after rook f3, she had to go back to c1, and now black played rook ef8, putting pressure on the bishop. She gave a check, but king h8, and now after rook h5, he went back to f6, and now the threat is knight e4, attacking the bishop on f2, and using the fact that rook on f1 is not supported enough. Rook h4 was played, and now after queen d7, Goryachkina resigned because knight h3 is a strong threat. And if she plays a move like king g2, then black can play queen f5, and now the threat is even e4, e3, or just queen f2. Because if a4 happens, then black can capture on f2. Takes, and because of knight on g5, white cannot escape. And if on queen f5 she plays queen c1, then knight e4 happens. And now the bishop on e2 is hanging, or the rook on e4 has to sacrifice. On h4 has to sacrifice. So that was a quick escalation of problems for white here. After only one bad move, like rook f1, it just collapsed. This position is from the game between Jorden van Foreest and Robert Hovhannisyan. And here white was to move, and he played knight f3. White has excellent pressure on the g6 pawn at the moment, and maybe he should have played queen g4 to continue his attack. And if black tried to open up his bishop by playing c5, then maybe just to play king h3 to step away from the danger. And in case of rook d2, to play bishop e4. To eliminate the bishop, and also to continue pressuring g6. And in case of rook d3, to take, and if he tries to get a passed pawn by cd, knight e6, queen d5, and rook g1, defending on g2, and still continuing the pressure on the g6 pawn. And I think in this position white is very close to winning. But still has to be careful because black has the d pawn. And the bishop pair is still on the table, so there has to be some precision included. But instead in the game, Van Foreest played knight f3, and black tried with c5. His idea is to connect these pawns in case white takes on d4. And he did take on d4, which seems like a bold choice. In case he took on g6, for example, takes twice, and if he plays now rook d3, now white could play bishop e4 to try to neutralize this bishop pair, and on a6 to just go rook f2. And here, if black takes on e4, for example, and exchanges queens, now white could take on e6 at a certain point. And I think this position is quite good for white, even though black also has his chances on the queen side, because 3 versus 1 is not naive at all. But instead, he took on d4, and after cd, he plays bishop e4, because if he doesn't do it on time, then black is going to play d3 himself, and he's going to completely shut down this bishop. So bishop e4 was played, but now black starts rolling his pawns. d3, queen f3, and now he takes. Queen e4, and now queen d5. And now white is in a tough situation here. He took on d5. If he tried to avoid connecting black's pawns even further with queen g2, then black would simply capture on a4. And if he tries hg, and rook a1, black would just take on g2, and after king takes, he would push a3. And the point is, if you take, then c3. And those two pawns are not going to be stopped at all. With the support of the bishop, it's not possible to stop those two pawns. Van Foreest played queen d5 here, but now after ed, it's looking very scary, and I think it's even lost at this point for white. He took on b5, and now a very nice move. Very nice move by black. Bishop a3. He cannot capture because, again, those two pawns are going to run. So white tries to somehow stop those pawns, but now he takes on b2, hg, king f3, and now bishop d4. Stopping the king from reaching e3. Rook d1, and now c3. Van Foreest took, but now after c2 he resigned because he cannot stop the pawn. It's going to promote, and it's game over. He cannot even take on d5 because of this skewer on the long diagonal. And because of that, he resigned. Now we have a position from the game between Sanan Sjugirov and Raunak Sadhwani. This bishop endgame, we see that white is the one who is playing for the win because of his better pawn structure and because all his pawns are on light squares, and all black's pawns are going to be on dark squares, which makes them a good target for white's bishop. So here black plays e5, and now white first improves his king, goes to e4, and after bishop f6, now it's time to somehow improve this bishop to open it up, because in this current situation, bishop is not very active. He needs more diagonals, and if he wants to somehow out-tempi black, he needs to open up the position with b4 and to try to infiltrate from f8 maybe, or even d8. So he tries bishop d2, bishop e7, bishop c1. Now they shuffle a bit to gain time. Bishop b2, bishop d6, and now bishop c3, bishop c7. Bishop c3 and bishop c7, and now b4. He's trying to open up the position. Black takes, and now bishop b4. Bishop d8, bishop f8, bishop f6, and now he pushes c5. And now here's the decisive mistake. He took on c5. And he's allowing his opponent to out-tempi him and to win the game, eventually. Instead, he should have played b5. And in case of c6, just bishop d8. And he can also start pushing on the queen side and create a passed pawn, eventually. In case the bishop gets distracted by g5 pawn. And if bishop d6, for example, then a5 still, bishop c7, a4, and if bishop a5 to stop the b4 pawn, bishop e7, and now on c6, he can push b4, and on c7, king d7. And now if king d3 happens, now there's a nice move, e4, sacrificing the pawn. If king c4 is on the board, then b3 takes, and if he takes on b3, then bishop c5 targets the f2 pawn, and this ending is going to be a draw. So in the game, he took on c5, bishop takes, and now a6. And now white is just going to stand on this diagonal, on b8, h2 diagonal. And he's going to wait for bishop to get to g7 when the bishop is on c7. For example, bishop e7, bishop c7, and now if bishop f6, now f3. And in case of bishop g7, bishop d8. And if you play bishop f6, you take, and king d5. And on a5, a4, and king has to go from this pawn. And white takes the pawn and wins the endgame. And if bishop d8, bishop h6, then after a4, black is either going to allow the king to get to f5 by playing king d6, and then he loses the g5 pawn, or he's going to lose the g5 pawn by moving the bishop, and this is also lost for black. Instead, he played bishop c5, and after f3, he played bishop b4, because bishop d4 also doesn't do much, because bishop d8, after bishop d8, black is not able to defend g5, so he loses the pawn anyways. f3, bishop b4 was played. He thought it's better just to lose the e5 pawn because it's still not a passed pawn. If you lose the g5 pawn, it's automatically making the g pawn a passed pawn. So he thought he might be able to put some pressure, put some resistance in this position. Bishop e7, bishop b2 was played, bishop d8, and after a couple of more moves, now white's king transfers to the queen side, tries to lure the king, and now after bishop b4, bishop f6, bishop f8. And here black resigned because now he's not able to save himself from getting his white's king to f5. For example, if he plays bishop d8, now after king d4, now black's king is not able to get to d6 to oppose white's king. And in case of bishop c7, just king e4, king f5, and he would eventually capture the g5 pawn. So that's it. And the last position is from the game between Alexei Shirov and Ahmed Adly. The last move from black was b4. And now a typical Shirov move, knight d5. Sacrificing the knight, but getting more space for his remaining pieces. And now a principal move, e d5, takes, and now knight b8. Black has extra piece, but his pieces are not harmonious at the moment. White plays rook h e1, trying to get his rook to e4 and include it in the attack. Rook d8, and now very important move, a5. Because if he tries rook e4 immediately, then black plays a5 himself. And he's connecting his pawns, and he will be able to consolidate with king b7, knight a6, rook c8, and eventually he would be able to defend the position. But after a5, the point is after queen takes a5, rook e4, now he's going to capture the b4 pawn. After bishop d8, he takes on b4, bishop c7, knight d4, and now black takes on d5. And white plays queen c3, trying to activate his queen and also pointing towards bishop c4 maybe. And now black gets greedy and takes on g2. Here I think just king d8 was a good move to escape from the pin, but still the position is quite unclear, and white has a good compensation for a sacrificed piece. And here, after queen g2, things get much tougher for black. Now white has knight f5. You cannot take on f5 because after bishop f5, if knight d7, then rook d6 is very strong. You cannot capture on f5 because if bishop takes, knight d7, rook d6 attacks the knight on d7 and puts tremendous pressure on the knight. If king d8, then queen takes f6, and in case of rook e7, just collect the rook and the game is finished. So rook e6 is played to defend against knight d6, and now bishop e4 is played. The bishop is not for free because, again, knight d6 would be devastating. So queen g4, and now knight d6. Takes, and bishop b5, but now queen c5. Shirov played, and black tries to untangle with knight d7, but now white takes. And queen takes and king takes doesn't work because of bishop f5. Also this leads to the same. So bishop has to capture on d7, and now rook c4. And now the only move to defend the bishop is queen takes f4, but now we have this, bishop b7. King b7, and after rook f4 takes, the bishop is going to fall. And after bishop e6, black is now trying to set up some kind of fortress, but he's not able to do so. Queen f6, rook d8, and now b3. Now he's going to lose his h5 pawn. After h5, he plays queen c3, and after king b7, he lost his h5 pawn, and in this position, Ahmed Adly resigned because he's going to lose the h5 pawn, and white is simply going to push his h pawn.